The late afternoon settled over the parking lot like a heavy veil, tinting everything with a yellowish light that seemed to hold more silence than color. The air was still, and every sound, the distant screech of a shopping cart, the echo of a metal gate, seemed like something unwilling to exist there. Eleanor Vance, the woman in the red dress, walked slowly to her car, balancing her shopping bags with a certain distracted elegance, as if accustomed to the gazes that always followed her. The fabric of her dress moved with her body, breathing in sync, while her blonde hair reflected the day's last light. Nothing about her suggested haste, just a common routine interrupted by an almost imperceptible detail, a brief look over her shoulder, as if something had touched the air around her. When she opened the trunk, a bag slipped from her hand and fell to the ground. The sound, muffled but sharp, cut through the stillness. She bent down to gather the items, and in that small gesture the atmosphere seemed to shift. Two men walked towards her. There was no urgency in their steps, just the studied slowness of those who measure the ground before advancing. One observed her car, the other her movements. Eleanor stood up slowly, her breath growing shallow, as if her body perceived what was about to happen before her mind did. On the other side of the parking lot, almost invisible in the vast greyness, stood John Miller, a hard-working man, and his daughter Sophia. Their clothes were worn, marked by the accumulated dust of many difficult days. The little girl held her father's hand with the delicate grip of someone afraid of losing him to the weariness of the world. John walked with firm steps, despite the hardship etched on his strong body and silent face. They seemed merely to be passing through the space, but fate was already drawing a slow convergence. Sophia was the first to notice the scene. She stopped abruptly, as if her heart had pulled the brake before her feet did. Her eyes fixed on Eleanor, the woman in the red dress, on how she recoiled an inch when the first man touched the car, leaving invisible marks of intimidation. Her father didn't immediately notice, lost in his own thoughts, in the continuous weight of his silent responsibilities. But Sophia tugged, his arm with gentle insistence, creating a link between what he needed to see and what he still tried to avoid. Eleanor remained still, bags in hand, trying to maintain a composure that no longer made sense. The second man approached closer than necessary, invading her space, as if to test the fragility of the silence. The wind blew lightly at that instant, lifting strands of hair from her face, revealing eyes that tried to appear firm, but carried a hidden plea. She looked around discreetly, searching for any presence that might break the circle tightening around her. It was then that John Miller finally noticed. His eyes met the scene quickly, and for a brief moment he seemed to measure his own insignificance against what he saw. He wasn't a man accustomed to interfering. The modern world had taught that everyone must carry their burdens alone, and perhaps that was why he hesitated. But his daughter's silent voice cut through him like an undeniable truth. He took a deep breath, and the air seemed to gain weight around them. Meanwhile, Eleanor took a step back and bumped hard against her car. The sound reverberated, echoing like a warning. One of the men looked at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a small gesture that revealed more threat than sympathy. Eleanor tried to regain control, straightening her body, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying her internal struggle not to show fear. She turned to pick up another bag, not to flee, but to try and hide her despair. Sophia squeezed her father's hand again. Her eyes weren't just asking for action, they were asking for humanity. That silent plea stirred something deep within John. He took the first step, then another. There was no rush, no heroism, just a decision born from a sense of justice that refused to be ignored. He walked like someone crossing a moral threshold, each step stripping away a little more of his fear and giving him a little more purpose. The men noticed him approaching but didn't back down. One of them lifted his face, analyzing the simple figure, smudged with dirt and fatigue. Perhaps they expected submission. Perhaps they chuckled internally at the possibility of being interrupted by someone who bore the mark of poverty on his body. The scene grew dense, as if everyone was caught in a single, suspended breath. Eleanor saw John approach, and something inside her reorganized. It wasn't exactly hope. It was the recognition that someone saw her. His presence filled the space between her and the danger, even before he reached her. The wind blew again, carrying dust and tension, creating an almost living silence. John slowed his pace when he got close enough to be noticed. He didn't speak, didn't raise his voice, didn't adopt an aggressive stance. His body, however, conveyed something that couldn't be ignored, a quiet firmness, the rare combination of strength and moral fiber that some men possess. Without fanfare, the two aggressors exchanged a quick glance, as if an unexpected doubt had arisen. Sophia, a few steps behind, observed everything with eyes that understood more than her age allowed. She trusted her father in a way that no wealth could buy, and that silent trust became the anchor that kept John immune to fear. Eleanor, breathing more slowly now, realized something was changing in the air. The men in front of her began to lose their composure, not through physical force, but through the moral presence rising before them. John, even without saying a word, dismantled the aggressor's distorted courage, as if his simple existence was a reminder that certain limits cannot be crossed without facing the weight of right and wrong. And, in that suspended instant, before any resolution took shape, the silence of the parking lot seemed to announce that something irrevocable was about to happen. Something that would forever change the lives of those three, not by the violence avoided, but by the gesture that was about to be made, a gesture not yet revealed, but already carrying the promise of transforming the destiny of all who would witness it. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're following us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The first man, the one with the scruffy beard and cautious eyes, took a step sideways, as if to gain an angle. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, a calculated gesture to create doubt. Eleanor swallowed hard, her fingers clenching the bag handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew any wrong move could accelerate the inevitable. The second man, younger and more impatient, chewed gum, with rehearsed indifference, but his eyes constantly darted between her and the car, assessing value, calculating risk. John stopped a few feet away. He said nothing yet, but his presence was a physical obstacle the others couldn't ignore. He slowly crossed his arms, broadening his silhouette against the dying light on the horizon. Sophia remained behind him, small but present, like a silent witness to something greater than any possible violence. It was the man with the beard who spoke first, his voice hoarse and laced with false cordiality. "Just having a chat with the lady here, boss. Nothing major." John didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, like someone evaluating the truth of a sentence by the weight it carried in the air. Eleanor felt something loosen inside her, not fear, but that paralyzing tension that precedes important decisions. She straightened her shoulders, regaining an inch of dignity that seemed lost moments before. The younger man spat his gum on the ground and stepped forward, testing limits. "What are you waiting for, old man?" The word dropped like a stone, but John didn't move. He just breathed, slow and deep, and in that simple gesture there was more strength than in any threat. Sophia held on to the hem of her father's shirt, not out of fear, but as a reminder that he wasn't alone, that she depended on him to understand what was right. Eleanor seized the moment. She took a step to the side, creating distance between herself and the two men. Her hands still trembled, but the movement was decisive. She looked at John, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that brief exchange of glances, something was said without words. Gratitude, recognition, an improbable connection between two worlds that shouldn't touch. The man with the beard noticed the change. His body stiffened, and he exchanged another look with his partner. It was clear the situation was no longer under control. John's presence wasn't threatening in the conventional sense. He didn't display a weapon, didn't shout, didn't advance. But there was something unsettling about it, the moral certainty of someone acting without ulterior motives. "She doesn't need your help," the younger man said, his voice now louder, trying to regain authority. John finally spoke. His voice was deep, calm, unhurried. "Maybe not, but I'll stay here anyway." The words were simple, but they carried a definitive weight. There was no direct challenge, no empty heroism, just the declaration that he wasn't leaving and that his presence was enough to change everything. The two men exchanged glances again, but this time the silence between them revealed something different. Hesitation. The man with the beard took a half step back, disguising the movement as if merely adjusting his posture. The younger man, however, still tried to maintain his facade. He spat on the ground and forced a humorless smile. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, old man." John didn't avert his gaze. There was no defiance in his expression, just a calm that came from somewhere deep, perhaps from the weariness of someone who had faced greater hardships than any empty threat. Sophia continued holding his shirt, and that small gesture seemed to be the source of all his firmness. Eleanor took the opportunity to put the bags in the trunk. Her hands still trembled, but now there was determination in her movement. She didn't rush, didn't despair. She simply did what needed to be done, as if reclaiming control of a moment that seemed lost. The sound of the bags thudding inside the car echoed in the empty parking lot, breaking some of the tension. The man with the beard took another step back, this time without disguise. He muttered something low to his partner, words that didn't reach Eleanor or John, but that carried the tone of someone who recognizes defeat without admitting it aloud. The younger man resisted for a few more seconds, his eyes still fixed on John, trying to find some weakness, some sign that he could reverse the situation. But there wasn't. John remained motionless, his arms still crossed, his breathing steady. He wasn't large or physically imposing, but there was something in his stillness that acted as an invisible shield, something the two men couldn't penetrate because it came from a place they didn't know, the simple dignity of someone who has nothing to lose except his own conscience. The younger man finally gave in. He spat once more, turned his face, and began to walk away. The man with the beard followed soon after, walking slowly, hands in his pockets, trying to maintain some composure as they distanced themselves. Eleanor watched them leave, and only then allowed the air to escape her lungs. In a long, shaky sigh, John remained standing until the two men disappeared behind a row of cars. Only then did he slightly relax his shoulders. Sophia let go of his shirt and walked around, positioning herself beside her father, her eyes still watchful, as if to make sure the danger had truly passed. Eleanor closed the trunk carefully, the sound echoing dry and final. She stood for a moment, her back to them, hands resting on the car, head bowed. When she turned, her eyes were moist, but she wasn't crying. She just breathed deeply, trying to recompose what had been shaken inside her. She walked towards John and Sophia. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as if she didn't know exactly what to say or do. When she got close, she stopped at a respectful distance. John watched her with a neutral expression, expecting nothing, demanding no recognition. It was clear he hadn't done it for a reward. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but firm. John nodded slightly, a discreet gesture that didn't ask for more words. Sophia looked at Eleanor with childlike curiosity, without judgment, just observing that elegant, shaken figure who contrasted so much with their world. Eleanor opened her purse and began searching for something inside. John noticed the movement and raised his hand, a soft but clear gesture. "No need," he said. She paused, her fingers still inside her purse, her eyes meeting his. There was an invisible barrier there, not of wounded pride, but of something deeper, the refusal to turn a human act into a transaction. John didn't want money. He didn't want it to become a paid favor. He had done what was right, and that was enough. Eleanor closed her purse slowly, understanding. She bit her lip, fighting against the emotion that threatened to overflow. She wanted to say something more, but words seemed insufficient, so she simply bowed her head, a gesture of respect that came from a sincere place. Sophia, who until then had remained quiet, took a step forward. She extended her small hand towards Eleanor, asking for nothing, merely offering a gesture. Eleanor knelt slowly, coming down to the child's height. She held the small hand gently, and for a brief instant their two worlds touched there, in that silent parking lot under the dying light of late afternoon. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. Her voice choked. "Sophia," the girl replied, her voice clear and calm. Eleanor smiled, a sad but true smile. She squeezed the girl's hand lightly before letting go and standing up. She looked at John once more, and this time there was something different in her gaze, not just gratitude, but a recognition of shared humanity, as if she had seen something she hadn't expected to find there. John made a move to turn, ready to continue his way, but Eleanor spoke again. "Do you live nearby?" He hesitated for a second, as if weighing his answer. Then he nodded briefly, without giving details. Eleanor sensed his reservation and didn't press. She just watched father and daughter begin to walk away, their figures growing smaller against the vast grey backdrop of the parking lot. Before getting into her car, Eleanor stood still, watching them walk. Sophia held her father's hand again, and the two walked with that calm that seemed to come from a lifetime of difficulties faced side by side. There was something comforting in that image, something that contrasted with the recently dissipated threat and brought a strange sense of restored order. Eleanor got into her car and closed the door. She rested her hands on the steering wheel, but didn't start the engine immediately. She needed a moment, just a moment, to feel what had happened, to understand how a hard-working stranger and his small daughter had changed everything without raising their voices, without violence, just with their presence. She looked in the rearview mirror and could still see the two silhouettes in the distance, walking towards the parking lot exit. Something stirred within her, a kind of unease she couldn't name. It wasn't just relief, it was something else. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was shame. Or perhaps it was the slow awakening of a conscience that had been dormant for too long. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the automatic parking lot lights began to flicker on, one by one. Eleanor started her car, but still took a few seconds before driving off. She observed the empty space around her, that ordinary place where something extraordinary had happened. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered who she really was, and what kind of world she had built around herself. A world where she needed to be saved by someone who had nothing, while so many around her who had everything simply passed by without seeing. She put the car in motion, driving slowly, as if the weight of what she had experienced was still settling within her. When she passed the parking lot exit, she instinctively turned her head, looking for them, but the father and daughter had already disappeared into the growing darkness of the night. The drive home was silent. Eleanor turned on the radio but quickly turned it off. She didn't want noise, she just wanted to think, or perhaps not think at all, just to feel that strangeness that still pulsed in her chest. The lit streets passed by the window, full of people, cars, life happening as it always did, indifferent and fast. When she arrived home, She parked in the garage and sat in the car for a few more minutes. The house was large, well decorated, well lit, everything in its place, everything as it should be. But somehow it seemed empty. She grabbed her bags and went inside, moving through the rooms with automatic steps, putting groceries in the kitchen, mechanically putting everything away. Later, sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands, she looked out the window. Outside, the city of Chicago remained lit, pulsing with that tireless energy that never stopped. But her mind was somewhere else. It was in that parking lot, in that suspended moment when everything could have been different. It was in the girl's eyes. It was in John's calm voice. It was in the simplicity of a gesture that asked for nothing in return. And for the first time, she wondered, what would she have done if she had been on the other side, if she had been the one? Passing by and saw someone in danger, would she have stopped? Would she have risked it, or would she have driven on as so many do, pretending not to see? The answer didn't come easily, and that, more than anything else, bothered her deeply. John and Sophia walked along the narrow sidewalk, crossing streets they knew by heart in Eastwood. Night had fully fallen, and the city lights cast long shadows that accompanied them with every step. The little girl still held her father's hand, but now with less tension. The danger had passed, and she returned to that natural tranquility of children who fully trust those beside them. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. John was never a man of many words, and Sophia had learned early on to read his silence. She knew when it was tiredness, when it was worry, when it was just quietness. This time it was something different. It wasn't sadness nor joy. It was simply the awareness of having done what needed to be done. They turned onto a darker street where the lights were sparse and poverty revealed itself without disguise. Small houses, peeling walls, precariously intertwined. Electrical wires. The smell of cheap food and smoke hung in the air. Some children were still playing in the street, their laughter echoing in the night, oblivious to the hardships around them. John greeted a few neighbors with a discreet nod. Everyone knew him. Everyone knew he was a man of his word, of hard work, of quiet integrity. When they arrived at their house, a simple brick structure with a corrugated tin roof, Sophia ran ahead to open the gate. Her father followed slowly, his shoulders heavy with the day's fatigue. Inside, the house was clean but Spartan. Few furnishings, no luxuries. But there was something there that many larger homes lacked: order, care, dignity. Sarah Miller, John's wife, was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She turned when she heard the door, and her eyes met her husband's. She didn't ask anything, but read on his face that something had happened. He just shook his head slightly, as if to say everything was all right, and she accepted without questioning. 20 years of marriage had taught her he would tell her when the time was right. Sophia went straight to the small room she shared with her younger brother Ethan Miller, who was already asleep in a makeshift bed with a thin mattress and patched sheets. She took off her worn shoes, placed her faded clothes on a chair, and lay down beside her brother. Before closing her eyes, she whispered a quiet prayer, as she did every night, asking for protection for her family and giving thanks for their daily bread. In the kitchen, John washed his hands in the small sink, letting the cold water run over his calloused fingers. His wife placed a plate of simple food on the table: rice, beans, a piece of shredded beef. He sat and ate slowly in silence while she finished tidying the kitchen. When he finished, she sat on the other side of the table, waiting. "Trouble today?" she asked, her voice soft. He chewed the last bite, swallowed, and then recounted, not with many details, just the essentials. He said there was a woman in distress, that he and Sophia were passing by, that he couldn't just leave. Sarah listened without interrupting, her eyes attentive, her hands clasped on the table. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, then she nodded slightly. "You did the right thing," she said, just like that. There was no exaggerated admiration, no drama, just the quiet confirmation that he had acted in accordance with the values that had always guided their family. John felt a relief he hadn't known he needed. It wasn't doubt about what he had done, but perhaps the weariness of always having to choose between the easy and the right. After dinner, he went out to the small backyard. He sat on a makeshift wooden bench, looking at the dark sky where few stars could pierce the city's light pollution. The air was cool, and the quietness of that moment brought him a peace he hadn't felt in days. He thought of Eleanor Vance, the woman in the red dress. He thought of the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability that the circumstances had exposed. He also thought of the two men, of their choice to intimidate someone weaker, and the ease with which they retreated in the face of something they hadn't expected, someone willing to stand firm. But above all, he thought of Sophia, of the girl's eyes when she tugged his sleeve, of the silent trust she placed in him, expecting him to do what was right, even without knowing exactly what would happen. That was what weighed most heavily. Not just the act itself, but the responsibility of being an example, of showing his daughter that the world, despite being harsh and unfair, still had room for simple acts of courage. He knew many would call him a fool, that they would say he should have kept going, that it wasn't his problem, that people like him didn't have the luxury of risking themselves for strangers. But he also knew that if he had kept going, something inside him would have died a little, and worse, something inside Sophia would have died too. The back door creaked softly, and Sarah appeared with 2 cups of weak coffee. She sat beside him, handed him one of the cups, and stayed there in silence, just sharing the moment. They didn't need to talk. After so many years together, so many difficulties faced side by side, their silence was filled with mutual understanding. "Did she offer you money?" Sarah asked after a long moment. "She did. I refused." She nodded, not surprised. That was the right thing. He took a sip of coffee, feeling the warm liquid go down his throat. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough for them," he said, his voice low. "If I should accept those things, you know, for the sake of the kids." Sarah turned her face to him, her eyes firm. "You're giving them something money can't buy. You're showing them who they should be." The words fell upon him like a silent blessing. He knew she was right, but even so, the burden of supporting a family with so little never ceased to weigh on his heart. Every day was a struggle to put food on the table, to keep the children in school, to ensure they had at least the basics. And yet he had refused money that could have eased some of that burden. But he also knew that some burdens cannot be eased with money. That dignity is built in small choices, in moments when no one is looking, in gestures that no one applauds, and that these choices, cumulatively, define who a person is. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Sarah asked, referring to the woman in the parking lot. He thought for a moment. "I think so. Physically, at least. And the rest?" He shrugged. "That's up to her." Sarah finished her coffee and stood up, lightly kissing her husband's head before going back inside. He stayed a few more minutes, alone with his thoughts, until the night's chill began to bite, and he decided to go inside too. Before lying down, he passed by the children's room. Sophia slept deeply, her face serene, a small hand resting on her chest. Ethan was curled up in the sheet, snoring softly. John stood at the door, watching them for a long moment. Those 2 children were everything to him. Every choice he made, every step he took was thinking of them, of the world he wanted to leave for them, of the lessons he wanted to teach. He knew he couldn't give them wealth, he couldn't guarantee comfort or material security, but he could set an example. He could show, through his actions, what it meant to be human in a world that often forgot the value of it. He closed the door slowly and went to his own room. Sarah was already in bed, almost asleep. He lay down beside her, the old mattress groaning under their weight. He closed his eyes, and the last thing that passed through his mind before sleep was the image of Eleanor Vance, standing in the parking lot, looking at him with those eyes that mixed gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't name, but that he recognized as the slow awakening of someone who had forgotten to see the world. And in some strange way, he hoped that encounter had changed something in her, just as it had confirmed something in him, that doing the right thing, even when it costs, was still worth it. The following days brought an unease Eleanor Vance couldn't name. She continued her routine, work at the office, social engagements, shopping, dinners, but something had changed. It was as if a thin film separating her from the world had been ruptured in that parking lot, and now everything seemed sharper, heavier, more real. She found herself thinking about John and Sophia at random moments, in the middle of a meeting, while reviewing spreadsheets, while driving through the lit streets of Chicago. The image of them walking side by side, the small hand holding the large hand, wouldn't leave her mind. And along with that image came a question that deeply bothered her. When had she stopped seeing? On Thursday evening, sitting in an upscale downtown Chicago restaurant with friends, she realized she wasn't following the conversation. The women around her talked about vacations, home renovations, light gossip about mutual acquaintances. Laughter punctuated their sentences. Wine glasses clinked in frequent toasts. Everything was familiar, comfortable, predictable. And, for the first time, she felt a strangeness towards that familiarity. "Are you okay?" one of her friends, Laura, asked, noticing her silence. "I am," Eleanor replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But it wasn't tiredness. It was something else. It was the growing sensation that there was a chasm between the world she lived in and the world where most people existed. A chasm she had always known existed, but had chosen not to see, not to feel, not to think about. On Saturday morning, she went for a walk. She didn't have a specific destination, just the need to move, to get out of the house, to do something different from the automatic routine she had been following for years. She walked through streets she normally avoided, crossed neighborhoods she only knew by name, observed faces she would never have noticed before. She saw a boy selling candy at a traffic light, the tired look of someone who already knew more about life than he should. She saw a woman with heavy bags waiting at a bus stop, her face marked by the exhaustion of working multiple jobs. She saw an elderly man sitting on the sidewalk, holding a sign asking for help, his eyes downcast like someone who had given up hoping for dignity. Each image pierced her in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't exactly pity, though there was compassion. It was something more uncomfortable, more personal. It was the growing awareness that she had built her life looking up, at what was missing, at what she still wanted to achieve, and never down at the invisible privilege that had always been there, supporting her every step. When she returned home, she sat on her porch with a cup of coffee and watched the street. Cars passed, people walked, life happened at its indifferent pace. But she couldn't stop thinking about John, about what had motivated him to stop, to risk, to stay. He had nothing to gain. On the contrary, he had everything to lose, and yet he had chosen to act. She, on the other hand, had everything: security, comfort, resources. And what had she done with all of it? She had built walls. She had isolated herself. She had convinced herself that the world out there wasn't her responsibility, that everyone should take care of their own lives, that there was no point in trying to change something too big to be changed. But John hadn't thought that way. He hadn't rationalized, hadn't calculated costs and benefits, hadn't hidden behind convenient excuses. He had simply acted. And in that simple gesture, there was more courage than she had managed to gather in her entire life. On Monday, she did something she had never done before. She looked for information on volunteering, on organizations that served underserved communities, on ways to help that went beyond sporadic donations made to ease her conscience. She didn't yet know what she would do, but she knew she couldn't continue living as before, pretending that the encounter in the parking lot hadn't changed anything. On Tuesday, she drove past the parking lot where everything had happened. She had no practical reason to be there, just an inexplicable urge to revisit the place. She parked in the same spot, got out of her car, and stood still, observing the empty space. It was just a parking lot, concrete, white lines, cars, nothing special. And yet, something that had indelibly marked her had happened there. She tried to imagine John walking towards her, Sophia by his side, the decision being made step by step. She tried to understand what was going through his head at that moment. Fear, doubt, or just the quiet certainty that there was no other choice. A supermarket security guard walked past her, looked with curiosity, but said nothing. She went back to her car, sat inside, and stayed there for a few more minutes, hands on the steering wheel, her mind far away. That night she dreamed. She dreamed she was back in the parking lot, but this time the positions were reversed. She was the one walking in the distance. She was the one seeing someone in danger. She was the one who needed to decide whether to stop or move on. In the dream, she hesitated, her feet glued to the ground, fear paralyzing every muscle. And then she heard the girl's voice, that clear, calm voice, asking, "Are you going to help?" She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the question still echoing in her mind. She got up, went to the kitchen, drank water slowly, trying to calm her thoughts. But the question wouldn't leave her. Are you going to help? In the following days, she began frequenting the Northside Community Outreach Center in Eastwood, a less affluent neighborhood of Chicago. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't post on social media. She didn't turn it into a performance of virtue. She went simply because she needed to do something, needed to understand, needed to be close to that world that had always been a few miles away, but that she had never truly seen. At the center, she heard stories. Women working 3 shifts to support their children, kids helping their parents with informal jobs after school, elderly people surviving on meager social security, dividing their money between medicine and food. Each story was a punch to the gut, not because of the tragedy itself, but because of the normalcy with which they were told, as if that hardship was simply part of life. Something to be accepted without protest. And in every face she looked for John's. Not literally, and she knew the chances of finding him were minimal, but she looked for that same quiet dignity, that strength that came not from arrogance or rebellion, but from the simple choice to continue being human despite everything. One afternoon, while helping organize clothing donations, an older volunteer, Mrs. Clark, sat beside her. "First time here?" Mrs. Clark asked, her voice gentle. "It is," Eleanor replied. "What brought you?" The question caught her by surprise. She was silent for a moment, thinking about how to answer. She could say something generic, something socially acceptable, but instead she told the truth. "Someone saved me, and now I need to understand why." Mrs. Clark smiled, a sad but understanding smile. "Sometimes we need to be saved to remember we can save too." The words stayed with her. As she drove home that night, through the lit streets, she thought about how many times she had passed by situations where she could have made a difference and hadn't. How many times she saw and pretended not to see. How many times she chose the comfort of indifference instead of the discomfort of action. It wasn't that she was mean. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was just that she had learned to live in a bubble where the world's problems were distant abstractions, statistics in news reports, something that happened to other people. John had burst that bubble. He had shown her that other people were real, were near, were worthy of something more than distant compassion. And now she couldn't go back. She couldn't live as before, pretending she didn't know, didn't see, couldn't do anything, because she had seen a man who had nothing do something that she, with everything she had never done, risk himself for a stranger. That night, before going to sleep, she picked up her phone and opened a map of Chicago. She looked for the neighborhood that John and Sophia had walked towards that day, based on the direction they took. She didn't know exactly where they lived, but she knew the general area of Eastwood. And she knew that somehow she needed to go back there. Not to offer money again, she had understood the refusal, but to truly thank him, to say that his gesture had changed something in her, to show that the seed he had planted unknowingly had begun to sprout. She didn't know if she would find them. She didn't even know if they would remember her, but she knew she had to try, because some debts aren't paid with money. They are paid with transformation, and she was beginning slowly and painfully to transform. The following Saturday, Eleanor drove to Eastwood. The morning sun lit the streets with that raw clarity that hides nothing, revealing every crack in the asphalt, every peeling wall, every sign of years of accumulated neglect. She parked her car on a main street where there was enough activity not to draw too much attention, and got out. She walked slowly, observing everything around her. Children played on the sidewalk with a deflated ball and pieces of wood serving as goalposts. Women chatted in doorways, exchanging news and laughter while hanging clothes on makeshift lines. Men sat on plastic chairs, playing dominoes under the shade of a bare tree. Life happened there with a simplicity that contrasted violently with the world she came from. Some looked at her with curiosity. It was impossible not to notice. Her clothes, her way of walking, the car parked on the corner, everything about her screamed that she didn't belong there, but no one was hostile. They just watched, assessing, trying to understand what she wanted. She wasn't sure where to begin. She had come with the idea of finding John and Sophia, but now, facing the vastness of that neighborhood, she realized how improbable it was to find them without an address, without a full name, without even knowing if they lived on that specific street. She stopped at a small corner store. The establishment was tiny, with cramped shelves full of basic necessities. A middle-aged man, Mr. Henderson, was behind the counter reading an old newspaper. He looked up when she entered. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he replied, his voice neutral, waiting. She hesitated. How to ask that question without sounding strange? How to explain? I'm looking for someone," she began, her voice uncertain. "A man who lives around here. He has a young daughter, about 7, 8 years old. Her name is Sophia." Mr. Henderson observed her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you looking for him?" She could have invented an excuse, but she chose the truth. "He helped me a few weeks ago in the supermarket parking lot. I just wanted to thank him." Mr. Henderson continued looking at her, weighing the sincerity of her words. Then he shrugged. "Lots of folks with young daughters around here, but if her name's Sophia and her dad's a hard worker, might be John Miller. He lives 3 blocks up, blue house with a green gate, but I don't know for sure if it's him." "Thank you," she said, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. She followed the instructions, walking through the narrow streets, past houses that all looked similar in their humble simplicity. When she reached the blue house with the green gate, she stopped on the sidewalk, her heart beating faster. It was a small, modest structure, but there was care there. The gate was painted, though the paint was peeling in some parts. The tiny yard was clean. A simple curtain covered the front window. All very humble, but dignified. She took a deep breath and rang the makeshift doorbell, a piece of metal that made a shrill sound when pulled. She waited, the seconds feeling like an eternity. Then she heard footsteps, and the door opened. It was her, Sophia. The girl recognized her immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mom!" she called, turning her head. "It's the lady from the parking lot." Sarah, John's wife, appeared soon after, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She observed Eleanor with a cautious but not hostile expression. There was curiosity there, and perhaps a little apprehension. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry to just show up like this unannounced. I wanted to speak with your husband, if possible." Sarah was silent for a moment, assessing. Then she nodded slightly. "He's in the back. I'll call him." Sophia remained in the doorway, looking at Eleanor with that childlike frankness that knows no embarrassment. Eleanor smiled at her, and the girl smiled back, shy but genuine. After a few minutes, John appeared, coming from the back of the house. He recognized her too, and for a fraction of a second, something passed through his eyes. Surprise, perhaps discomfort, perhaps just curiosity. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said again. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice calm. There was a brief silence, heavy with something neither of them knew how to name. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor continued, the words coming out with difficulty, "for what you did. I know I thanked you that day, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I needed to come back here and say that it changed something in me." John nodded but said nothing. He wasn't a man of many words, and this situation clearly made him uncomfortable. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said, finally. "I know, but I wanted to." Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, took a step forward. "Want to come in? Have some coffee?" Eleanor looked at Sarah, then at John, then at Sophia, who was still there, observing everything with attentive eyes. "If it's not too much trouble." "It's not," Sarah said, opening the gate. They went inside. The house was even smaller inside than it looked from the outside, but there was something welcoming about it. The furniture was old, some of it makeshift, but everything was clean and organized. Family photos hung on the walls. A simple crucifix above the table, the smell of fresh coffee coming from the kitchen. Eleanor sat at the small table while Sarah served coffee in mismatched cups. John sat on the other side, still visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Sophia settled beside her father, leaning lightly against him. "Do you live far from here?" Sarah asked, trying to break the ice. "I do, across town. And you came all this way just to say thanks." Eleanor took a sip of the coffee, feeling the strong, sweet liquid go down her throat. "I came because I needed to understand," she said, her voice low. "I needed to understand why you stopped, why you risked it. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. And yet—" John fidgeted with his cup, uncomfortable with the turn of the conversation. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. "No," Eleanor replied firmly. "That's not true. I've spent my whole life seeing situations where I could have helped and didn't, where it was easier to pretend I didn't see that it wasn't my problem, and you had nothing to gain, and you still did it." Silence fell over the table again. Sarah looked at her husband, then at Eleanor, understanding something that didn't need to be said aloud. "He's always been like that," Sarah said softly. "He can't just walk by when he sees someone in need." "And you?" Eleanor asked, looking at Sarah. "Aren't you afraid that something might happen to him?" Sarah smiled, a sad but serene smile. "I am, every day. But I'd rather be afraid of losing a good man than be ashamed to live with a coward." The words hit Eleanor like a direct blow. She felt her eyes sting, but held back the tears. This family, who had nothing in material terms, had something she had never had: moral clarity, quiet courage, dignity that didn't depend on a bank account. "May I ask one more thing?" Eleanor said after a moment. "Sure," John replied. "What did you feel at that moment, when you decided to stop?" He thought for a long time, as if searching for words for something he had never verbalized. I felt that if I didn't stop, I'd lose something. I can't explain it right. But it was like, by walking away, I'd stop being who I am. I'd stop being the father I want Sophia to see. Sophia looked at her father, and there was so much love in that gaze that Eleanor felt a pang in her chest. "My dad's the best in the world," Sophia said simply, and in that childlike sentence, spoken with the raw honesty of children, lay a truth that no adult eloquence could surpass. Eleanor stayed there for another hour. She talked with the family, heard stories, met Ethan when he woke from his nap. Every minute in that simple house was a silent lesson about what truly mattered in life. When she finally stood up to leave, she felt that something inside her had permanently rearranged itself. At the door, before leaving, she turned to John. "If you ever need anything at all, please look me up." He nodded, but she knew he never would. It wasn't pride. It was simply the way he was, someone who gave but didn't ask. "And if you ever do," he said, surprising her, "now you know where to find me." Eleanor smiled, feeling genuine emotion for the first time in a long time. She said goodbye to everyone, hugged Sophia affectionately, and walked back to her car. When she started the engine and began driving back, she looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The family was at the door, waving, and in that simple image she saw something she had spent her whole life searching for without knowing it. Proof that goodness still existed, that doing the right thing was still worth it, that humanity, despite all the harshness of the world, was not yet completely lost. The following weeks brought subtle but profound changes. Eleanor continued to frequent the Northside Community Outreach Center, but now with a different purpose. It was no longer about trying to understand or ease her conscience. It was about being present, about being part, about using what she had to help in real and consistent ways. She began teaching basic computer skills to adults who had never had access to computers. She helped organize a job placement campaign for young people in the neighborhood. She used her professional contacts to secure interviews, to open doors that had always been closed to those people. Every small victory, a job secured, a certificate received, a family helped, brought a satisfaction that no previous professional success had ever brought. But she also learned. She learned about resilience, listening to the story of the woman raising 4 children alone, working as a cleaner. She learned about generosity, seeing poor neighbors sharing the little they had with those who had even less. She learned about dignity, meeting men and women who, despite all hardships, never lost their composure, their manners, their respect. And little by little she began to visit the Millers' home, not frequently, and she understood she needed to respect their space. But every now and then, always bringing something simple, a cake, books for the children, school supplies, never money. She had understood that wasn't what it was about. On one of these visits, Sarah invited her to stay for lunch. It was a Sunday, and the house was full of extended family, John's elderly parents, a brother with his wife and children, some cousins. The food was simple: rice, beans, chicken stew, salad. But there was abundance in the way it was shared, in the way everyone served themselves without ceremony, laughing, talking, making noise. Eleanor sat at the makeshift table in the backyard, squeezed between 2 children who looked at her with curiosity. John was at the makeshift grill, turning pieces of meat with a patience that seemed infinite. Sarah moved among the people, ensuring everyone had enough food, expertly organizing the chaos with silent mastery. "Do you have family?" Grandma Miller, John's elderly mother, asked, a woman with white hair and calloused hands. "I do," Eleanor replied. "My parents live in another state. I'm an only child. And a husband, children." The question, asked with the frankness of someone from another time, caught her off guard. "No," she replied, and for the first time she felt that answer weigh differently. It never seemed like the right time. Grandma Miller nodded, but asked no more questions. She just put more food on Eleanor's plate, a maternal gesture that asked no permission. During lunch, Eleanor observed the dynamics of that family, the small squabbles between the children, quickly resolved by the adults, the inside jokes that made everyone laugh, the way John was treated with quiet respect by the other men, as if his word carried special weight, the way Sophia helped serve the younger ones, learning early what it meant to care. There was something there that couldn't be bought or manufactured. It was genuine connection, bonds forged by years of living together, shared hardships, simple joys celebrated together. And she, who had always had everything in material terms, realized how poor she had been in things that truly mattered. After lunch, while the women washed dishes and the men talked in the backyard, Sophia approached her. "Can you help me with my homework?" the girl asked shyly. "Of course," Eleanor replied, smiling. They sat in a quiet corner, and Sophia opened her worn notebook. It was math, simple problems the child was struggling to solve. Eleanor helped patiently, explaining in different ways until Sophia understood. "Are you a teacher?" the girl asked. "No, I work with computers." "Must be hard." Eleanor laughed, softly. "Sometimes, but not as hard as it seems." Sophia looked at her with those big, serious eyes. "My dad says you're good, that you're trying to be better." The words, spoken with childlike simplicity, struck something deep. She didn't know John spoke of her, that he had noticed her attempts to change, that he had recognized her effort. "Your dad is good too," Eleanor said, her voice choked. "Very good." "I know," Sophia replied, returning to her homework. "Everyone knows." Later, when Eleanor said her goodbyes and went home, she drove in silence, her mind full of images from in that day. She arrived at her spacious, modern apartment in Chicago, with its impeccable decor and its well-arranged solitude. She turned on the lights, placed her purse on the sofa, and stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. Everything was perfect, everything was in its place, and everything seemed somehow empty. In the following months, the connection between Eleanor and the Miller family strengthened organically. She became an occasional but constant presence, someone who belonged in a strange but genuine way to that world that had once been completely foreign to her. She helped when Ethan got sick, discreetly paying for the doctor's visits the family couldn't afford. She secured a scholarship for Sophia at a better private school, using her contacts without fanfare. She created job opportunities for John, who refused some but accepted others, always maintaining his dignity and tact. And in this process, she was also transformed. She learned to measure wealth differently. She learned that having a lot didn't mean being a lot, and that being poor in possessions didn't mean being poor in value. She learned that courage came in silent forms, that kindness didn't need an audience, that dignity was built in daily choices that no one applauded. There was resistance, of course, friends who didn't understand why she wasted her time with that, colleagues who found her involvement with those people strange, family who suggested she was having an existential crisis and needed therapy. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care about those opinions. She had found something that made sense, something that filled a void she hadn't even known existed. On a cold winter night, almost 6 months after the encounter in the parking lot, she received a call from Sarah Miller. Sarah's voice was tense, worried. "He fell at work. He's at City General Hospital. It's not serious, but can you come?" Eleanor dropped everything and went. She arrived at City General Hospital, walked through cramped, dimly lit corridors, and found the family grouped in a small waiting room. Sarah was pale. Sophia was crying softly. Ethan was asleep in Aunt Carol's lap. John had fallen from scaffolding, breaking his arm and some ribs. Nothing fatal, but serious enough to mean months without work, months without income, months of extreme difficulty for a family already living on the edge. Eleanor didn't think twice. She organized everything. She spoke with doctors, ensured proper treatment, took care of the costs without making it an emotional burden for the family. And when John finally woke up, she was there beside Sarah and the children. He saw her, and his eyes filled, not with tears, for he was not a man to cry, but with something deeper, gratitude mixed with discomfort, wounded pride mixed with relief, the contradiction of someone who always gave and now needed to receive. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know," Eleanor replied, holding his hand lightly. "But you didn't have to either, and yet you did." And in that moment something was completed. The circle that had begun in a parking lot with a simple act of courage closed there, in a hospital room, with another simple act of reciprocation. It wasn't a debt being paid. It was humanity being recognized on both sides in a world that often forgot its value. When John was discharged weeks later, Eleanor was there to pick them up. She drove them home, helped him inside, stayed for a few hours making sure they were okay, and when she finally left, it was already night, and she drove through the dark streets with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The feeling that her life had purpose, that she mattered in a real way, that she had chosen to be part of something bigger than herself. And that night, for the first time since everything had begun, she slept in peace, without restless dreams, without unanswered questions, just with the quiet certainty that even with all the mistakes and delays, she was finally on the right path. A year had passed since that afternoon in the parking lot. Chicago remained the same, indifferent and noisy, but something fundamental had changed in the lives of those people who met by chance and transformed by choice. Eleanor no longer lived in the spacious, empty apartment. She had moved to a smaller, simpler place, closer to the Northside Community Outreach Center, where she now worked full-time. She had left her corporate job, with its high salaries and empty demands, and dedicated her skills to something that made a real difference. She helped create job training programs, secured partnerships with companies, becoming a bridge between two worlds that rarely touched. It wasn't an easy life. The money was less, the difficulties greater, and there were days when she wondered if she had made the right choice. But then she would see a young person getting their first job after going through the training program, or a single mother finally gaining access to childcare so she could work, or a family emerging from extreme poverty because of opportunities Eleanor had helped create. And in those moments, she knew that yes, she had chosen correctly. John had returned to work after his recovery. His arms still ached on cold days, and he couldn't carry as much weight as before. But he kept working, kept providing, kept being the man he had always been. Only now there was something different. He was no longer alone, carrying the burden. Eleanor had arranged for him to have access to better working conditions, companies that respected rights, that offered safety. It wasn't much, but it was enough to relieve some of the constant pressure that had weighed on his shoulders for years. Sophia was growing up. At 9 years old, she was a scholarship student at a private school, where her teachers constantly spoke about her potential, her intelligence, her eagerness to learn. The girl had dreams now. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to help people like her father helped, but in a different way. And for the first time, those dreams didn't seem impossible. There was a path now, paved with opportunities that hadn't existed before, sustained by people who believed in her. The relationship between Eleanor and the Miller family had solidified into something that transcended gratitude or charity. It was genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and true affection. She had dinner at their house regularly, and they occasionally visited her new apartment, though always with a certain discomfort, as if they feared not belonging in that more polished space. On a Sunday afternoon, everyone was gathered in the small backyard of the Blue House. It was Sophia's birthday, and there was simple cake, soda, colourful balloons tied to the clothesline. The children ran around, the adults chatted, and there was that atmosphere of uncomplicated joy that only genuine celebrations have. Eleanor was sitting next to Sarah Miller, watching Sophia play with the other children. The girl was radiant, wearing a new dress Eleanor had given her as a gift, her eyes shining with that pure happiness that only children can fully feel. "She's different," Sarah said softly, "more confident, more full of hope." "She was always special," Eleanor replied, "but now she believes she can be anything she wants, and that you helped give her." Eleanor felt her eyes sting. She turned her face, pretending to observe something in the distance. "I just opened some doors. She's the one walking through them." "Even so." John approached, bringing 2 glasses of juice. He handed one to each woman and sat on the ground, leaning his back against the wall. He had aged in the last year, the hard life taking its toll, but there was also a lightness in him that hadn't existed before. Less tension, less invisible weight. "Are you happy?" he asked suddenly, looking at Eleanor. The question caught her off guard. She thought for a moment before answering. "I think so. In a way I never was before." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You've changed," Sarah said. "Since that day." "Everyone's changed," Eleanor replied. "Even you. You let me into your lives even without knowing me, even with me being so different." "You proved you weren't that different after all," John said. "Where it counts, at least." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, because it was true. In the end, beneath all the differences in class, education, origin, they were just people trying to do the right thing, trying to live with dignity, trying to create a slightly better world for those they loved. Sophia ran up, her face flushed from playing. "Aunt Eleanor," she called the woman now without formality, "come play with us." Eleanor laughed and stood up, letting herself be dragged into the game. For an hour, she was just another big kid, running, laughing, forgetting all the complications of the adult world. And in those simple moments, she felt a joy that no professional success, no material achievement had ever provided. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky orange and pink, the guests began to say their goodbyes. Eleanor helped gather the plastic cups, tie up trash bags, organize what remained of the party. It was manual labor, simple, but she did it willingly, as a natural part of that extended family she now belonged to. Before leaving, she knelt in front of Sophia. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Thank you, Aunt Eleanor, for everything." The girl hugged her with that disproportionate strength children have, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, but an emotion too deep to be easily named. When she finally said goodbye and walked to her car, John accompanied her to the door. They stood for a moment, the sky darkening above them, the city's hum in the distance. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? I'm the one who should thank you. For proving it's still worth it. Doing the right thing, you know. Sometimes you wonder if it makes a difference, and you proved it does." She held his arm lightly. "You saved my life that day, in a way that goes beyond what happened in the parking lot. You showed me who I wanted to be." He smiled, that rare but genuine smile that transformed his tired face. "Funny, I thought I was just doing the obvious." "For you it was. For me, it was a revelation." They said goodbye, with a brief but sincere hug, and she got into her car. She drove slowly through the neighborhood streets of Eastwood, observing life happening around her, Children playing, families sitting on the sidewalks, neighbors chatting, all simple, all difficult, all real. When she arrived home, she didn't turn on the television, didn't open her computer, didn't look for distractions. She just sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea in her hands and let the quietness of the night envelop her. She thought about everything that had happened, in how a single moment of terror and courage had unleashed a series of changes that completely transformed her life. She thought about the woman she was before, closed off, indifferent, lost in a life that seemed perfect but was profoundly empty. And she thought about the person she was becoming, more open, more present, more human. The path was still long, and she knew there was still much to learn, many mistakes to correct, many bridges to build. But for the first time, she felt she was walking in the right direction. Night fell completely, and the stars began to appear one by one, piercing the darkness. She thought of Sophia, that bright girl who had the whole world ahead of her now. She thought of John, that simple man who was richer in character than anyone she had ever known. She thought of Sarah, his wife, of their family, of all those who lived with so little but gave so much. And she thought of herself, that woman who needed to be saved to learn to save, who needed to be seen to learn to see, who needed to receive kindness to understand what it means to offer it. Chicago continued to pulse around her, indifferent and eternal, full of stories that would never be told, of lives that would never be noticed, of small gestures that changed everything without making a sound. And there on that small balcony, on that quiet night, she felt gratitude, not for the life she had, but for the life she was building, brick by brick, choice by choice, gesture by gesture. Tomorrow there would be work. There would be difficulties, there would be moments of doubt, but there would also be purpose, connection, meaning. And that, she now knew, was worth more than any empty comfort she had left behind. She finished her tea, went inside, and before sleeping looked out the window one last time. Outside, the city slept and dreamed, full of good and bad people, of sad and happy stories, of endings and new beginnings, and she, who for so long had been just another person passing by, was now part of something bigger, not through heroism, not through saintliness, but simply by choosing to see, by choosing to stay, by choosing to believe that a simple gesture, multiplied by many, could indeed change the world. And perhaps that was what mattered in the end. Not great revolutions or spectacular transformations, but just the silent courage to do the right thing when no one is looking, to help when it's easier to walk by, to believe in kindness, even when the world seems to conspire against it. Eleanor closed her eyes and slept, and for the first time in a very, very long time, her dreams were light, populated by faces she loved, by places where she belonged, by a life that finally made sense. On the other side of Chicago, in the blue house with the green gate, John also slept, beside his wife Sarah, who knew him better than anyone, near the children who were his whole world. And if he dreamed that night, he dreamed of simple things, peaceful days, honest work, family reunited, enough to live with dignity. He didn't ask for more than that. He never had. And in that simplicity of desires, in that contentment with the essential, there was a wisdom that the world, in all its sophistication, had long forgotten. The city breathed, the night passed, and two lives which should not have crossed remained intertwined by the choice to have been human when it mattered, to have chosen to see when it was easier to ignore, to have proven, each in their own way, that goodness still existed, that courage was still worth it, that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was still the only thing that truly mattered. And perhaps in the end, that was the only story that needed to be told, that of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, not for glory or recognition, but simply because they refused to let the harshness of the world harden their hearts. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.